If you're drawn to real-life mysteries, dark secrets, and stories that keep you up at night, you're in the right place. We uncover the chilling truths behind the world's most disturbing crimes. No faces, no fluff, just facts, fear, and unforgettable twists. Like what you hear? Smash the like button. Want more gripping stories? Hit that subscribe button. Don't miss a single case, turn on notifications and stay ahead of the truth. This isn't just crime. This is the dark side of human nature, exposed. Milwaukee is not the kind of city people imagine when they think of unspeakable horror. Known for its breweries, its festivals, its Midwestern resilience, it is a place that prides itself on balance, on everyday life. But even here, darkness finds its way into the ordinary. Even here, a night out can turn into a nightmare. On April 1, 2024, 19-year-old Sade Robinson left her home expecting nothing more than a simple evening. A first date, a chance to connect. What she did not know was that this ordinary choice would become the last one she ever made. Sade's life was one filled with promise. She was a college student at Milwaukee Area Technical College, working diligently toward her goals. Friends described her as ambitious but never arrogant, always willing to laugh, to comfort, to share. Her family knew her as the type of young woman who carried responsibility gracefully. She balanced part-time jobs with her studies, never complaining, always pushing forward. She wanted to achieve something lasting, not just for herself, but for the people who believed in her. She was careful, too. Friends said she was cautious when it came to new people, not the type to take wild risks. She valued her safety. She let people know where she was going, who she was with. She wasn't naive. But even the most careful person can fall victim when someone with darker intentions decides to cross their path. Like so many her age, Sade used dating apps. In modern life, these platforms have become both opportunity and danger, spaces where love stories are born, and where predators sometimes lurk, hiding behind carefully crafted words and photos. It was through one of these apps that she crossed paths with a man named Maxwell Anderson. To her, it seemed like an ordinary interaction. A few messages exchanged, a plan set for the evening. Nothing alarming. No warning signs loud enough to trigger suspicion. What Sade could not see was the truth behind his profile, the layers of deception, the manipulative charm, the calculated decision that would turn a casual meeting into something far more sinister. It was early evening when Sade left her home. The spring air still carried a chill, the streets slick with the remnants of a late rain. She dressed simply, comfortably, her phone clutched in her hand. Friends recall that she mentioned the date casually. She wasn't nervous, wasn't suspicious. This wasn't a stranger who gave her reason to hesitate. To them, it seemed like just another story in the endless cycle of young adulthood. Her last digital footprints were routine. A text here. A social media like there. But as the hours passed, her phone grew quiet. Messages sent to her went unanswered. Calls rang with no reply. For a girl as connected and responsible as Sade, the silence was unusual. And unsettling. By morning, the unease had grown. Sade did not come home that night. Her bed remained neatly made, the pillow untouched. She did not show up for class, did not message her friends, did not contact her family. Her mother called repeatedly, each unanswered ring tightening the knot in her chest. The sound of voicemail became unbearable, a cruel echo of absence. Friends tried rationalizing it. Maybe she stayed with someone. Maybe her phone died. Maybe she just needed space. But even these explanations began to crumble under the weight of time. 24 hours had passed. And Sade was gone. When Sade's family realized she had truly vanished, they contacted authorities. A missing persons report was filed, and with it, the gears of investigation began to turn. Detectives quickly pieced together her last known steps. Phone records, digital messages, surveillance footage. Each detail added a piece to the puzzle. And all those pieces led to the same name, Maxwell Anderson. Investigators searched her room. Nothing was missing. No signs she had packed to leave, no indications of a plan to run away. It was as if she had stepped out expecting to return in a few hours. Everything in her life suggested continuity, school assignments pending, plans with friends upcoming, family events she was looking forward to. There was no reason to believe she would vanish voluntarily. The silence of her room was deafening, speaking louder than any words could. It whispered of a life interrupted. Her family's world collapsed. Every unanswered call cut deeper. Every hour without word sharpened dread. They searched, prayed, clung to hope. But behind every prayer lay the fear that something unthinkable had happened. And as investigators began to trace Sade's path to her date with Anderson, that fear started to solidify into a chilling possibility, that the man she had trusted enough to meet was not what he seemed. On the night of April 1, 2024, Sade Robinson became a missing girl. But she was more than missing. She was the victim of something far darker. Something that would soon come to light in gruesome, unimaginable detail. Her disappearance was only the first chapter of a story that would shake Milwaukee, devastate her loved ones, and reveal the horrifying truth about the man she thought was just a date. Predators rarely look the part. They don't wear flashing signs announcing their danger. Instead, they move through the world under a cloak of normalcy, blending into the noise of daily life. For Maxwell Anderson, that cloak was his greatest weapon. To neighbors, he was polite enough. To coworkers, unremarkable. He didn't draw attention, didn't spark alarm. But behind closed doors, a storm of violence brewed, one that would erupt when he crossed paths with Sade Robinson. Anderson was in his early 30s. Old enough to project a sense of experience, yet young enough to mingle easily with women like Sade. His digital presence was carefully curated. On dating apps, he came across as approachable, stable. He wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. Predators like him don't rely on charisma alone, they rely on patience, on calculated words typed late at night. A compliment here. A promise of honesty there. He constructed just enough trust to lure women into lowering their guard. When Sade agreed to meet him, she believed she was meeting an ordinary man. What she didn't know was that Anderson's ordinariness was a disguise. Neighbors would later say Anderson was quiet. He didn't cause problems. He wasn't the kind to host loud parties or draw attention. But that silence was deceptive. Behind that quiet demeanor, he lived a fractured existence. There were signs of instability, of anger bubbling beneath the surface. Failed relationships. A lack of meaningful friendships. A growing sense of isolation that twisted into something darker. Anderson's life wasn't filled with the markers of success or joy. Instead, it was marked by resentment, by loneliness, and by a thirst for control. And when he couldn't find control in his own life, he sought it elsewhere. Experts say predators often hunt not with claws and teeth, but with words, with charm, with patience. They search for vulnerabilities, for openings. They identify women who seem trusting, who appear willing to meet. Anderson wasn't extraordinary in appearance. He didn't need to be. His power lay in manipulation, using ordinary conversation as bait. For Sade, the red flags weren't obvious. How could they be? Millions of people go on first dates every day. She believed she was safe. She believed she was in control. But Anderson had already chosen her. Those who later studied Anderson's behavior would recognize the signs of control. He didn't simply want companionship. He wanted dominance. He wanted to decide how the night would go, how the story would end. In text exchanges, he projected calm. In person, he radiated confidence. But underneath was calculation. Every move he made that evening was intentional. From the way he spoke to the way he steered the date, it was about power. To him, Sade wasn't a partner. She was prey. In daylight, Anderson could pass as harmless. But darkness suited him. Behind his public mask was a fascination with violence, with control over life and death. Police would later uncover disturbing elements in his private world, search histories, conversations, behaviors that hinted at his violent tendencies. None of it was visible to Sade that night. None of it was visible until it was too late. This is the chilling reality: predators often walk among us unnoticed. They shop in the same stores. They ride the same buses. They smile in passing. But inside, their intentions are anything but ordinary. When Anderson and Sade finally met, it seemed simple. A casual evening. A chance to talk, to see if there was a connection. To her, it was routine. To him, it was execution. The most haunting detail of this story is that in those first moments, there was no screaming, no violence. Just two people walking side by side, one oblivious to the danger, the other concealing a storm that would soon erupt. Predators choose their victims carefully. Not because of who they are, but because of opportunity. Anderson likely saw Sade as the perfect target, young, trusting, cautious but not suspicious. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't someone who would expect danger on a first date. That was his advantage. For him, this wasn't about romance. It was about control. About domination. About feeding the darkness he carried inside. In the hours leading up to Sade's disappearance, Anderson played his role well. He was calm. He was patient. He was charming enough to keep her from sensing danger. But inside, he had already decided how the night would end. It wasn't a question of if, only when. That's what makes predators like him so terrifying. They wear masks so convincingly that by the time the truth emerges, escape is nearly impossible. Maxwell Anderson was no stranger. Not in the way that mattered. He was the man next door, the man on a dating app, the man who seemed harmless. But beneath that facade was something monstrous. And when his path crossed with Sade Robinson's, the mask came off. What began as a first date was about to spiral into one of the most horrifying crimes Milwaukee had ever seen. April 1, 2024. The day began like any other for 19-year-old Sade Robinson. She went through her usual motions: schoolwork, quick conversations with friends, scrolling through her phone. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing suggested that the hours ahead would become the most important of her life. For Sade, it was just a date. A first meeting. A chance to connect with someone new. But in reality, it was the opening move in a deadly game that she never chose to play. Like many her age, Sade approached dating with a blend of caution and curiosity. She wasn't reckless, but she wasn't shut off from possibility either. A first date was not unusual. It was a rite of passage in the modern digital age, where connections are forged not through chance encounters, but through swipes and taps on glowing screens. She told a few friends about her plans that evening. She promised she'd check in afterward, a small but important ritual that young women know all too well. It was safety in communication, reassurance through routine. And then she left home, never imagining that those would be the last conversations she would ever have with them. The final texts Sade sent were ordinary, mundane even. Quick notes to friends. Casual updates. The kind of messages that fill the background noise of everyday life. But in retrospect, they carried a chilling weight. They were the last proof of her presence before the silence began. Her phone, once a lifeline connecting her to friends and family, would soon become a record of absence. Calls unanswered. Messages unread. Notifications piling up, mocking the hope of a response that would never come. The moment Sade and Maxwell Anderson met in person marked the turning point. To her, it was simply an introduction, a handshake, a smile, the nervous laughter of strangers meeting for the first time. To him, it was something else entirely. Anderson had already written the script for that night. He wasn't there for companionship. He wasn't there for connection. He was there to execute a plan, one that would end in unthinkable violence. The two walked together, ordinary enough to anyone watching. Just a man and a woman on a night out. But inside that facade, danger pulsed, hidden and waiting. Investigators later confirmed that Anderson and Sade stopped briefly at a restaurant. Surveillance cameras captured them together, their interaction appearing calm, even casual. To outsiders, nothing seemed amiss. She laughed lightly, he leaned in as if engaged. It looked like a typical date, two people learning about one another over shared food. But beneath the surface, something darker lingered. Anderson was not focused on conversation. He was focused on control. He studied her, calculated her trust, measured the space between them not in inches, but in opportunities. After the meal, the night stretched on. Anderson suggested they continue elsewhere. Whether Sade felt hesitant, we may never know. But like many young women, she likely brushed aside any fleeting discomfort, convincing herself that everything was fine. She had done what society teaches, shared her plans, told friends where she was. She believed she was taking the right steps to stay safe. But predators like Anderson thrive in the cracks of trust. And as the minutes ticked by, he was already guiding her deeper into his trap. At some point after leaving the restaurant, Sade's trail went cold. No more surveillance footage. No more digital footprints. Her phone stopped transmitting signals. Her social media activity ceased. It was as if she vanished into thin air. But she hadn't vanished. She had been swallowed by Anderson's control. By late evening, her friends grew uneasy. Messages went unanswered. Calls rolled into voicemail. They told themselves she was fine, maybe still out. But as the hours stretched into early morning, worry hardened into dread. They knew Sade. She wasn't the kind of person to simply disappear. Something was wrong, and they felt it in their bones. The exact details of what happened in those final hours remain shrouded in horror. Investigators believe that Anderson brought Sade back to his home. There, the facade of normalcy fell away. What began as a date transformed into violence. The man who had smiled across the table from her became something monstrous. His need for control turned into brutality, his obsession with domination culminating in a crime that would leave investigators shaken. For Sade, the night ended not with a goodbye or a safe return home, but with silence. A silence that stretched through the night, into the morning, and into the desperate searches of her family and friends. For Sade Robinson, the promise of youth, of possibility, of a life yet to be fully lived, was stolen in the span of a single evening. What she thought would be a first date became her last. And what her family thought was just another night became the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt them forever. Every murder has a point of no return. A moment when intent transforms into irreversible violence. For Maxwell Anderson, that moment came the night he lured Sade Robinson back to his home. What happened inside those walls remains a haunting mystery. But through fragments of evidence, forensic science, and chilling logic, investigators pieced together the final hours of her life, a reconstruction of brutality that turned an ordinary home into a chamber of horror. Neighbors would later recall nothing unusual. No screams piercing the night. No signs of struggle echoing through thin apartment walls. That silence is often the most chilling detail. It suggests precision. It suggests control. Anderson knew how to commit violence without drawing attention. He didn't lash out recklessly, he orchestrated. For Sade, the night may have started with small talk, a glass of water, perhaps music playing faintly. But lurking just beneath the surface was a predator calculating his next move. When detectives later entered Anderson's residence, the signs of violence weren't immediately obvious. He had tried to clean, to conceal. But forensics sees what the human eye misses. Tiny traces, blood spatter invisible under normal light, fibers clinging to surfaces, microscopic fragments of DNA, all painted a story. They showed that violence erupted in the kitchen. They showed a struggle, brief but fierce. And they revealed what investigators feared most, that Sade never had a chance. Anderson wasn't just physically stronger, he was prepared. He controlled the environment. He controlled the timing. He controlled the outcome. Psychologists analyzing the case suggest he may have restrained her quickly, overwhelming her before she could scream. Others believe he used manipulation until the last moment, catching her off guard with sudden, shocking violence. Either way, the evidence pointed to a rapid escalation. Sade didn't walk willingly into death, she was ambushed by it. The official cause of death would later be determined through autopsy and forensic reconstruction. The details remain sealed in court documents, but investigators confirmed that Anderson inflicted fatal blunt force trauma and sharp force injuries. It wasn't a single blow. It wasn't quick mercy. It was prolonged, brutal, and intentional. The violence was not just about killing. It was about dominance. Anderson didn't simply want Sade gone, he wanted to strip away her autonomy, her life, and her very humanity. Why does someone commit such calculated cruelty? Forensic psychologists believe Anderson's actions reflected deep-rooted pathology. This was not impulsive rage. It was premeditated violence. He had chosen Sade. He had orchestrated the encounter. And once she was in his control, he enacted a plan that had likely lived in his mind long before that night. Murder, for him, was not just an act. It was a performance of power. Forensics revealed signs of struggle. Objects displaced. Marks on surfaces. Indicators that Sade fought with everything she had. But in that confined space, her resistance was tragically futile. Anderson had the advantage, strength, preparation, and control of the environment. Her fight, though desperate, became evidence. It spoke for her when she could not. Every scratch, every mark told investigators that she did not surrender easily. Once Anderson killed Sade, the crime shifted. Violence gave way to concealment. His focus turned from domination to destruction. Blood evidence was wiped, though imperfectly. Items were cleaned, though not thoroughly. He tried to erase what had happened. But science is unforgiving. No matter how hard he scrubbed, fragments of truth clung stubbornly to every surface. And those fragments would later unravel his attempt at concealment. Detectives built a chilling timeline. Around midnight, Sade was last seen alive. Within an hour, violence erupted inside Anderson's home. By the early morning hours, she was gone. Phone records, surveillance data, and forensic evidence merged into a haunting story. While her friend slept, while her family waited for her return, Sade's life was being extinguished in silence. The murder of Sade Robinson was not spontaneous. It was not accidental. It was the cold, deliberate choice of a man who saw her not as a human being, but as an object to be destroyed. That night, inside a quiet home in Milwaukee, Maxwell Anderson crossed a line he could never return from. He transformed a first date into an execution. And while Sade's life ended within those walls, the horror of what Anderson did next ensured her story would haunt the city forever. When a life is taken, the violence is often only the beginning. For some killers, the aftermath is just as chilling as the act itself. For Maxwell Anderson, murder was not the end of the story. It was the start of something even darker. With Sade Robinson's body before him, Anderson faced a choice. To call for help? To surrender? To admit the horror of what he had done? He chose instead to erase her, to dismember, to destroy, to scatter the pieces of her existence as if she were never real. Dismemberment is not impulsive. It requires tools, time, and a terrifying level of detachment. Anderson didn't panic. He planned. He prepared. Investigators would later determine that he used knives from his own kitchen. Ordinary utensils, transformed into instruments of grotesque mutilation. He worked with precision, reducing Sade's body to fragments, not out of necessity, but out of a pathological drive to control even in death. This was not simply about hiding evidence. It was about domination carried beyond the grave. Anderson didn't purchase special tools. He didn't bring equipment from outside. He relied on what was already around him: kitchen blades, household items. Forensic examiners later identified cut patterns consistent with knives found in his home. The blades bore microscopic traces of blood and tissue, even after he attempted to wash them. The simplicity of it was terrifying. Everyday objects, the kind found in any home, repurposed for something unimaginable. The act itself was cold, methodical. Anderson divided her body into pieces, placing them into bags and containers. He cleaned surfaces, wiped handles, rinsed drains. But no matter how meticulous, no matter how careful, he could not erase it all. Tiny fragments remained. A drop missed. A smear overlooked. Forensics is relentless. And in his arrogance, he underestimated how much science can uncover. After dismembering Sade, Anderson attempted disposal. He transported pieces of her remains in his vehicle, discarding them in scattered locations across Milwaukee County. It was a grotesque scattering of evidence, a fragmented attempt to deny her family the dignity of a complete burial. He wanted her gone, not just as a living being, but as a memory. But this choice would become his undoing. Because every location, every piece left behind, became a breadcrumb trail leading investigators back to him. The horror came to light when Sade's remains were discovered. A passerby stumbled upon what appeared to be human tissue. Law enforcement was called, and soon, the shoreline and wooded areas became active crime scenes. Each discovery was devastating. Pieces of a young woman who had once laughed, dreamed, and hoped. A life reduced to fragments scattered across the city she called home. For investigators, it was confirmation of their worst fears. For her family, it was a wound beyond words. DNA testing confirmed the remains belonged to Sade Robinson. Forensic anthropology and pathology provided further insight into the nature of the dismemberment. The cut marks, the precision, the sequence of events, they all pointed to Anderson's hand. Even attempts at cleaning could not hide his crime. Luminol revealed bloodstains invisible to the naked eye. Drain traps held microscopic tissue fragments. His car reeked of bleach, yet tests still identified biological evidence. Every attempt to erase only confirmed his guilt. Why dismember a victim? For forensic psychologists, the answer lies in control and dehumanization. By cutting a body into pieces, a killer strips away identity. The victim ceases to be seen as human and becomes parts, objects to be moved, hidden, or destroyed. In Anderson's case, the act seemed less about panic and more about pathology. He didn't just want to hide Sade. He wanted to annihilate her existence, to make her unrecognizable even in death. It was cruelty at its most calculated. With every piece of evidence recovered, detectives tightened the circle around Anderson. Surveillance footage placed him near disposal sites. Phone data tracked his movements. Forensics tied his kitchen, his knives, his car to the crime. The dismemberment, intended to conceal, instead exposed him. The very act that was supposed to erase Sade's existence became the foundation of the case against him. For Sade's loved ones, the discoveries were shattering. No parent, no sibling, no friend should ever face the reality of identifying a loved one by fragments. And yet, even in pieces, her story spoke louder than Anderson's attempt to silence it. Every discovery told the world, she was here, she lived, and someone took her away. For Anderson, the dismemberment was supposed to erase. Instead, it revealed the depth of his monstrosity. The disappearance of Sade Robinson didn't remain a mystery for long. What began as a missing persons report rapidly escalated into a full-blown homicide investigation. Milwaukee detectives understood one fact from the start: a 19-year-old college student doesn't simply vanish. There's always a trail, digital, physical, human. And with each hour that passed, urgency intensified. The first step in any investigation is to reconstruct the victim's last known movements. Detectives interviewed family, friends, and classmates. They reviewed phone records, social media activity, and surveillance cameras near the restaurant where she was last seen. Quickly, a name rose to the surface: Maxwell Anderson. He was the last person known to have been with Sade that night. A stranger turned key suspect in the blink of an eye. Sade's phone may have gone silent, but its last signals told a story. Investigators traced pings to an area near Anderson's home. Call records showed her final conversations lining up with the time she was believed to be with him. Meanwhile, Anderson's phone betrayed him. Data revealed his movements that night, his path from the restaurant, back to his residence, and later to isolated areas where remains would eventually be found. In the digital age, secrecy is a myth. Every step leaves a footprint. And Anderson's digital footprint screamed guilt. Armed with a warrant, investigators searched Anderson's home. At first glance, it was ordinary. Neat, quiet, unremarkable. But to trained eyes, the details spoke volumes. Luminol testing revealed hidden bloodstains across the kitchen and hallway. Drain traps contained tissue remnants. Knives bore microscopic cut marks consistent with dismemberment. It was a scene scrubbed of surface evidence, but science cut deeper. And beneath Anderson's attempts at erasure, the truth bled through. Detectives canvassed neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances. The responses painted a portrait of a man who lived in shadows. Quiet, withdrawn, sometimes unsettling. No one suspected him of violence, but no one truly knew him either. At the restaurant, staff remembered seeing Anderson with Sade. They recalled her politeness, her laughter, and his watchful silence. Details that seemed meaningless at the time became invaluable in reconstructing the night. Piece by piece, witnesses confirmed what the evidence suggested: Sade left with Anderson. She never left his control again. Surveillance footage became one of the most damning elements of the case. Cameras captured Anderson's vehicle near the restaurant, near his home, and later in the areas where Sade's remains were discovered. Though he believed he was discarding evidence in secrecy, the city itself was watching. Every stop, every pause, every late-night drive was captured in grainy but undeniable clarity. Those images would later anchor the prosecution's timeline, linking him beyond question to her disappearance and death. When Sade's remains were discovered, the investigation shifted from suspicion to certainty. DNA confirmed her identity. Cut patterns matched the knives recovered from Anderson's kitchen. Detectives no longer had a missing persons case. They had a homicide. And every clue pointed to one man. Step by step, detectives built the case. Digital evidence placed Sade and Anderson together. Forensic evidence tied his home and tools to her remains. Surveillance footage tracked his movements. Witness statements confirmed her last moments in his company. It wasn't just circumstantial. It was a mosaic of damning facts, each reinforcing the other, each stripping away his mask of normalcy. Detectives studied Anderson's actions in the days following Sade's disappearance. His lack of outreach to her friends or family was telling. He offered no concern, no questions, no visible effort to explain her absence. Instead, he retreated into silence. He cleaned obsessively. He avoided contact. His behavior reflected not grief, but guilt. The pattern was familiar to investigators: a killer retreating, consumed not by remorse, but by fear of being caught. With evidence mounting, detectives knew they had their man. An arrest warrant was issued. Anderson's home became ground zero for the storm. When officers entered, he offered little resistance. His mask had cracked, his control gone. He was no longer the quiet stranger, he was a suspect caught in the web of his own violence. The investigation into Sade Robinson's murder was relentless. Detectives worked day and night, weaving together the strands of truth that Anderson tried desperately to cut apart. And when the picture was complete, it revealed not just a murder, but a monster hiding in plain sight. For Sade's family, answers came at a devastating cost. But for Anderson, there was no longer any place to hide. By the time detectives secured an arrest warrant for Maxwell Anderson, the case against him was ironclad. Surveillance footage, forensic matches, digital trails, and the horrific discovery of Sade Robinson's remains all pointed to one man. Anderson thought he had time. He thought he could stay hidden behind his mask of silence. But the net was already tightening. Every move he had made since that night was tracked, logged, and dissected by investigators who were no longer hunting for a missing woman, they were hunting her killer. Before making the arrest, police watched Anderson closely. They monitored his routines, his comings and goings, his phone activity. They wanted to ensure he wasn't planning to flee or destroy additional evidence. To neighbors, he looked like his usual self, withdrawn, quiet. But behind the scenes, every movement was under a microscope. Detectives knew they couldn't wait much longer. If Anderson sensed the walls closing in, he might vanish. And a man who could dismember a body was capable of anything. It happened at dawn. Officers surrounded Anderson's home in a coordinated strike. Doors were sealed off. Back exits were covered. There would be no escape. When they knocked, there was no immediate response. Seconds felt like hours. Finally, Anderson appeared, caught off guard in the early light. His face betrayed shock, not terror, but disbelief that his private horrors had been laid bare. Commands rang out. He was ordered to the ground. Cuffs snapped around his wrists. For the first time since that fateful night, Maxwell Anderson was no longer in control. Word of Anderson's arrest spread rapidly across Milwaukee. Neighbors who had once described him as quiet or ordinary now struggled to comprehend that the man living among them was accused of such brutality. For Sade's family, the news was bittersweet. Relief that a suspect was caught. Pain that it could never bring her back. Hope that justice might follow. For the community, it was a reminder that danger sometimes hides in plain sight, in the face of a man you pass every day without notice. The interrogation began within hours of the arrest. Detectives laid out the evidence piece by piece, the surveillance footage, the forensic matches, the DNA. They gave him every opportunity to explain. Anderson sat in silence at first. His body language was rigid, his gaze fixed downward. He shifted occasionally, but offered nothing. When he did speak, his answers were short, evasive. He denied knowing details. He claimed gaps in memory. He insisted on his innocence despite the overwhelming mountain of evidence. But the cracks began to show. His voice faltered under pressure. His timeline shifted with each round of questioning. He contradicted himself, unable to maintain the illusion of control. Interrogators used strategy, empathy, pressure, silence. They reminded him of Sade's humanity, of her family waiting for answers. They pressed on the lies in his story, forcing him into corners he couldn't escape. Psychologically, the goal was clear: break the mask. And though Anderson never offered a full confession, his behavior in that room told detectives everything they needed to know. He wasn't the calm, calculating predator anymore. He was a cornered man, unraveling under the weight of his own crime. Detectives didn't hold back. They presented him with photographs of evidence recovered from his home. They explained how luminol exposed the blood he thought he had cleaned. They described how GPS and surveillance placed him at disposal sites. Every fact stripped away his denials. Every revelation painted him deeper into the corner. Anderson shifted from denial to silence, and silence to anger. He cursed, he glared, he refused to speak further. But silence wasn't a shield anymore. The case didn't need his words, the evidence spoke louder. After hours of interrogation, Anderson was officially booked. His fingerprints, mugshot, and personal details were logged into the system. The once ordinary man was now a murder suspect, his name linked forever to a crime that shocked the city. Behind bars, his control was gone. No more cleaning, no more hiding, no more pretending. Just time, endless hours in a cell to sit with the reality of what he had done. Milwaukee mourned and raged. News outlets replayed his arrest footage, analyzing every detail of his stoic face. Commentators speculated about motive, about pathology, about how someone so ordinary could be so monstrous. For Sade's loved ones, grief deepened. They would have to endure hearings, trials, media coverage. Justice was still far away, and the process would be long and painful. But there was one certainty now: Anderson was no longer free. The arrest of Maxwell Anderson marked a turning point. From predator to prisoner, from control to captivity. His silence could no longer shield him. His lies could no longer protect him. The evidence was overwhelming, the case airtight. For Sade Robinson, justice was beginning its long, agonizing path. For Anderson, the facade had shattered. The man who once prowled in shadows was now exposed, and the world would never forget his name. The murder of Sade Robinson had already shattered Milwaukee. But the trial of Maxwell Anderson transformed grief into spectacle. Inside the courthouse, the air was heavy with tension. Families clutched tissues, journalists filled rows of benches, and attorneys adjusted stacks of files. Every detail of that night would now be aired under oath, in the stark light of justice. For Sade's loved ones, this was the moment they had both dreaded and demanded, facing the man who had stolen her life. On the first day, the clerk read aloud the charges: first-degree intentional homicide, mutilation of a corpse, and evidence tampering. Each word hung in the air like a blade. Sade's family bowed their heads, struggling against tears. Anderson sat motionless, his face unreadable, eyes fixed on nothing. For the public, it was confirmation of what investigators had whispered for months. For the jury, it was the weight of a decision that would shape the rest of his life. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted Anderson as a cold, calculated predator who lured Sade under the guise of a date and ended her life in an act of unspeakable brutality. They promised to present forensic evidence, digital records, surveillance footage, and witness testimony that would remove any doubt of his guilt. The jurors listened intently, their eyes fixed on the man at the defense table. The picture was grim, the evidence overwhelming, the story horrifying. Anderson's defense team attempted to sow doubt. They suggested gaps in the timeline, questioned the reliability of forensic methods, and implied that no one had physically witnessed Anderson commit the act. They leaned heavily on the principle of reasonable doubt, urging jurors to remember that suspicion was not proof, and that the state carried the burden of certainty. But the strategy seemed thin against the mountain of evidence soon to be revealed. The state's strongest weapon was science. Forensic experts took the stand to detail what Anderson had tried so desperately to erase. Luminol results revealed blood traces throughout his kitchen. Drain samples confirmed tissue remnants belonging to Sade. DNA testing matched her remains to knives recovered from his home. GPS data from his phone placed him at disposal sites where her body was found. Each revelation tightened the noose. Jurors scribbled notes, their faces grim. The courtroom felt colder with each slide, each chart, each fact. Then came the surveillance evidence. Cameras had captured Anderson's vehicle trailing the route investigators mapped from his home to the disposal areas. Though grainy, the footage was damning. Jurors could see his car, time-stamped, aligning perfectly with the times investigators said he discarded evidence. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was something worse, an undeniable pattern. Perhaps the most harrowing moments came when Sade's friends and family took the stand. They described her vibrant personality, her plans for the future, her last text messages. Her mother's voice cracked as she spoke of unanswered calls, of waiting by the door for a daughter who never came home. Her father's silence in the gallery spoke louder than words, a man gutted by loss. The jury, though instructed to remain impartial, could not help but feel the weight of grief fill the room. Throughout the proceedings, Anderson remained unerringly stoic. He rarely reacted to testimony, never glanced toward Sade's family, never flinched as the gruesome evidence was presented. To some, it was the face of guilt. To others, it was the mask of a man disconnected from humanity. But one thing was clear, his silence spoke volumes. As days passed, the defense faltered. Their arguments failed to counter the avalanche of forensic evidence. Their cross-examinations often reinforced the prosecution's case instead of weakening it. Jurors appeared increasingly skeptical of the defense's narrative. The story Anderson wanted to hide was unraveling, thread by thread, in front of the entire city. In closing, the prosecution spoke directly to the jury. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a 19-year-old girl who trusted a man, and that trust was shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. Maxwell Anderson thought he could erase her. But science, evidence, and truth will not be erased. The defense urged jurors to remember the standard of proof. But by then, the case was too strong. The jury deliberated, reviewing every piece of evidence. Though they were tasked with calm reasoning, the emotional gravity of the case weighed heavily. It wasn't about speculation anymore. The evidence was overwhelming, the story undeniable. The trial of Maxwell Anderson exposed not only the brutality of his crime but also the resilience of a community demanding justice. Sade Robinson's name was spoken, remembered, honored. Her story could not be erased by knives, bleach, or lies. And as the verdict loomed, the city braced itself for the final act of the courtroom drama, the judgment of a killer who had believed he could hide forever. After weeks of testimony, exhibits, and arguments, it all came down to this moment: 12 jurors, one decision. The courtroom was packed. Reporters jotted frantic notes. Families clutched one another's hands. The tension was suffocating, a silence so complete it seemed the air itself was waiting. Everyone knew, in the next few minutes, Maxwell Anderson's fate would be sealed. The judge reminded the gallery, silence must be observed. No outbursts, no interruptions. Yet beneath that silence, emotions churned like a storm. On one side sat Sade's family, holding on to the hope that justice would finally be spoken aloud. On the other, Anderson sat with his attorneys, his face impassive, his hands folded tightly. The foreperson of the jury stood, verdict form in hand. The clerk asked the question that would change everything. On the charge of first-degree intentional homicide, how does the jury find the defendant? The foreperson's voice was steady, but the words carried the weight of the city. Guilty. The room exhaled in gasps and muffled sobs. Sade's mother broke into tears, her face buried in her hands. Her father's jaw trembled, eyes wet but fixed forward. Anderson did not flinch. The clerk continued. On the charge of mutilating a corpse, guilty. On evidence tampering, guilty. 3 words echoed again and again: guilty, guilty, guilty. The judge pounded the gavel for order, but emotion could not be contained. Years of grief and weeks of testimony collapsed into one moment of release. For Sade's family, it was bittersweet justice. Nothing could bring her back. Nothing could undo the horror. But there was solace in knowing that the man responsible would never walk free again. For the public, it was validation that truth, though slow and painful, had triumphed. While the courtroom erupted, Anderson remained eerily calm. No sigh, no visible shock, no whisper of regret. His stillness was chilling, as if the verdict wasn't about him, as if he were already elsewhere in his mind. To many in the gallery, his lack of reaction was its own form of cruelty. Even in the face of judgment, he gave nothing. No remorse, no apology, no humanity. But his silence no longer mattered. His fate was sealed. The judge addressed the court, affirming the jury's decision. He thanked the jurors for their service, acknowledged the unbearable pain of the victim's family, and confirmed that sentencing would be scheduled soon. His words were measured, professional. Yet even he could not hide the gravity of the moment, the acknowledgement that a 19-year-old's life had been extinguished by a man who now sat shackled, guilty on all counts. After court adjourned, Sade's family faced cameras and microphones. Their grief poured out in words choked with tears. She trusted him. She should have been safe. And now we will never see her graduate, never see her laugh again. But today, justice was spoken. Their voices cracked, but their strength was unshakable. They had carried her story into the courtroom, and now into the world, refusing to let her memory fade. Across Milwaukee, and across the nation, the verdict dominated headlines. News outlets replayed courtroom footage, legal analysts dissected strategies, and commentators questioned how Anderson had hidden his darkness for so long. Social media erupted with outrage, mourning, and solidarity. Hashtags carrying Sade's name trended nationwide. For a moment, the noise of a city converged on a single truth: Sade's killer had been caught, judged, and condemned. For Anderson, there was no longer a mask to wear. Cameras captured his shackled wrists, his bowed head, his silent shuffle into custody. This was the man who had once moved freely through the city, now reduced to a prisoner. His name, his face, his crime, forever synonymous with cruelty. The walk of the guilty was short, but its meaning stretched endlessly. The verdict in the case of Maxwell Anderson was more than a legal decision. It was a declaration that Sade Robinson's life mattered, that her story would not be silenced, and that the man who tried to erase her could never escape the truth. For her family, justice was a balm, not enough to heal, but enough to breathe. For Anderson, the gavel's echo marked the end of freedom, the end of denial, the end of his control. And as the city moved forward, one fact would never change: the name Sade Robinson would live on, her memory stronger than the man who tried to destroy it. Weeks had passed since the verdict. But the story was not over. Now came the final act: sentencing. The jury had spoken, guilty on all counts. Now it was the judge's responsibility to determine how Maxwell Anderson would pay for the life he had stolen, the horror he had inflicted, and the permanent scar he left on Milwaukee. The room was tense, silent except for the shuffling of papers and the quiet sobs of family members. Everyone knew what was coming, but the gravity of the moment still felt crushing. The prosecution began by reminding the court of the brutality of the crime. They spoke of the calculated nature of the murder, the desecration of Sade's body, the attempts to erase her existence. This was not just a killing, the prosecutor said. It was cruelty beyond measure. And for such cruelty, there must be the maximum penalty. The request was clear: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The defense had little left to argue. They asked for mercy, suggesting that Anderson's lack of criminal history and his psychological instability should be considered. They spoke of potential rehabilitation, of a man broken rather than purely evil. But their words felt hollow, dwarfed by the mountain of pain and evidence already on record. Even some jurors who had returned to watch the sentencing shook their heads at the argument. Then came the voices that mattered most: Sade's family. Her mother's words cut the room in half. "She was my baby. She was everything to me. And he didn't just take her life, he tried to erase her. He tried to throw her away like she didn't matter. But she mattered. She mattered every single day of her life, and she will matter for the rest of mine." Her father, voice trembling, said, "I will never walk her down the aisle. I will never hear her call me Dad again. But I want him to hear me now: you didn't win. You didn't erase her. You only showed the world how strong her light was." Friends, classmates, and even professors submitted statements, all echoing the same truth: Sade was bright, kind, ambitious, loved. And her absence would haunt them forever. When given the chance to speak, Anderson rose. The room braced for words of remorse, perhaps an apology. But none came. Instead, he muttered only a few sentences. "I didn't do what they say I did. That's all." The silence that followed was deafening. Not remorse. Not acceptance. Just denial, even as the evidence towered over him. For Sade's family, it was another wound. For the judge, it was confirmation: a man incapable of acknowledging his crimes. Finally, the judge spoke. His words were deliberate, heavy, final. "This court has heard the evidence. This court has heard the voices of a family forever broken. And this court has seen no remorse from you, Mr. Anderson. The brutality of your actions defies comprehension. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you, Maxwell Anderson, are sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You will never again walk free." The gavel fell with a sharp crack, echoing through the room like a final nail sealing Anderson's fate. Tears flowed freely on one side of the courtroom. Relief mixed with sorrow: justice had come, but nothing could replace what was lost. On the other side, Anderson was led away in shackles. His expression never changed. No apology, no recognition, no humanity. Just silence. As deputies escorted him down the hallway, the sound of his chains was the last echo of his presence in that room. Though the trial was over, the story was not. Sade's memory lived on in her community. Scholarships were created in her name. Vigils were held on her birthday. Her friends kept her spirit alive with stories, photos, and laughter through tears. For Milwaukee, her case was a reminder of vulnerability, of trust betrayed, and of the resilience of families who refuse to let darkness win. For true crime watchers across the nation, her story became one of those haunting cases that stays in the mind long after the headlines fade, not because of the killer, but because of the life that was lost. The story of Sade Robinson does not end with Maxwell Anderson's sentencing. Her story lives on through the voices of those who loved her, through the justice that ensured her killer could never harm again, and through the reminder that even in tragedy, truth can prevail. Maxwell Anderson thought he could erase her. Instead, the world now remembers her. The courtroom had emptied. The cameras had been packed away. The news cycle had moved on. But for those who loved Sade, the story would never end. Her friends remember her not for the way she died, but for the way she lived. They remember her laughter echoing down dorm hallways, her meticulous meal prep for class projects, the way she would bring coffee for anyone who looked tired. Her mother keeps her room exactly as it was. Her clothes still hang in the closet. Her notebooks remain on the desk, frozen mid-semester, like a life interrupted mid-sentence. The Maxwell Anderson trial was over. The sentence was final. But justice, in a case like this, is only partial. Because true justice would mean bringing Sade back. And that, no gavel can deliver. In the wake of her death, her family started a scholarship fund in her name. Each year, it will help young women in Milwaukee pursue their education, the very thing Sade was working so hard for. Maxwell Anderson thought he could erase Sade Robinson. But he didn't understand something essential: love is a record that cannot be destroyed. A life well lived echoes far longer than any crime. In the end, Sade's story is more than a cautionary tale. It is a reminder to trust carefully, to cherish fiercely, and to remember that evil can wear a friendly face. And yet, even in the face of such darkness, light can endure. Sade Robinson's name will not fade. Her story will not be forgotten. In memory of Sade Robinson, 2004 to 2024. May her light never dim. Now that you know Sade's story, I want to hear from you. What do you think is the most important thing we can do, as friends, as families, as communities, to protect people from predators like Maxwell Anderson? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Sade's family still reads every message, and your words might bring them comfort or inspire change.